Welcome to the instructional video on using Lieutenant Planckster to run scraper pipelines. First, you will navigate to Lieutenant Planckster login page and log into Kubeflow with your credentials. When you first log into Lieutenant Planckster, you will notice many features and pages, but only a few of them are really relevant and useful. First, let's look at pipelines. Pipelines are the collections of code and resources, the workflows that gather data and produce the end products that you require. Here you can see a list of the active pipelines. The next page we're going to look at is Kubeflow experiments. Experiments provide the context in which pipelines are run. They allow for test and full runs of pipelines as well as some troubleshooting. As you can see from the fact that we have already a climate monitoring experiment and a disaster tracking experiment, the other function experiments can serve is grouping pipelines by some sort of subject matter. As you can see from the previous runs of this disaster tracking experiment, it has run various different pipelines and even different versions of the same pipeline. There are many ways to initiate a pipeline run from Lieutenant Planckster. However, we recommend, as the most straightforward, doing so from within an experiment. As I'm already in the disaster tracking experiment, I will click the Create Run button and be prompted to configure this run. The first thing I must do, of course, is choose the pipeline. We will choose Sentinel-5P for this demo. Using this pipeline automatically populates the pipeline version with the latest version. You shouldn't need to change this unless you specifically want to use an earlier version. The run name is also automatically populated, but it may usually be a good idea to replace that with something a bit more descriptive. The next set of inputs that we will need to fill are the run parameters. These are specific to the pipeline that you've chosen, but one thing that you will notice in common for all pipelines is the tracer ID and also the job ID. Tracer ID can provide a narrower categorization that you can use to group together runs of the same pipeline if they're used for a very similar purpose. For our purpose, let's just call this Maui Wildfire Demo, and the job ID, since this is the first one using this tracer ID, we can just provide 1. If we were to decide we needed to run this pipeline again with slightly different parameters later on, but for a very similar purpose, we could provide that run the same tracer ID and then job ID 2 and so on. Now, for the Sentinel-specific run parameters, we'll begin with start date time, which tells the pipeline when to begin scraping. We'll set as our start date the 18th of August 2023. We'll start at the very beginning of that day. And if we want to run through August 30th, we'll set the end time as the very beginning of August 31st. Interval tells the pipeline how frequently to take its snapshots. For our purposes, every 6 hours should be fine. The interval is provided in minutes, so we will provide 360. And the next 4 parameters are the 2 longitudes and 2 latitudes that make up the bounding box around the geography we want to evaluate. In our case, we want northwestern Maui, and I have those saved so that I can copy and paste them in. The final run parameter, dataset eval scripts, is how we tell the pipeline what kinds of evaluations it needs to do on the data. This is a more complex input and needs to be submitted in a structured format called JSON. If you're not familiar with that, there's a description in the help documentation here, as well as an example of what the input might look like. And this example happens to be the default configuration that you will probably usually use for the Sentinel pipeline. So in our case, we are just going to copy this example and paste it here. This is a little bit difficult to read in this format, but there is the JSON editor, which makes it easier to see and edit the changes as you need. But once we've entered everything, we can click the Start button to initiate the run. Initiating the run returns you to the page of the experiment from which the run was created. From here, you can click into any of the previous runs, including the one you just created. While it's running, you can check its progress. After it has completed, you can check its status and outputs. For instance, the Sentinel scraper pipeline is composed of 3 steps, and in this particular run, they have all succeeded. Clicking on a step allows you to check all sorts of information about that specific step, including, very helpfully, the logs. But one important note is that logs expire after 24 hours, so make sure to check any logs within that window.